Well, thank you very much. I'm Patrick Foulis from The Economist, and the opening panel is on the rise of digital platforms. It seems particularly pertinent as of this morning. 7 of the world's 10 most valuable companies are platform firms. The big 5 American companies are forecast to make 10% of all profits in America this year, and that's projected to approximately double over the next few years. I was talking to Tristan, one of our panelists, who reminded me the typical millennial looks at their phone 150 times a day. So as well as dominating the stock market, the economy, and they also dominate how we spend our time. They have a powerful role in the political process, which has become clear in both Europe and the US over the last couple of years. And as Guy pointed out, their power, their influence has risen to the top of the political agenda, particularly with Zuck's appearance in Congress a mere 10 days ago. So we have a fantastic panel of people who cover the entire spectrum of the impact of platform firms from the psychological to the economic. And I'd like to start by asking each of the panelists if they could just quickly introduce themselves to those of you who've not met before. Would you like to start?
Sure. I'm Ben Thompson, and I'd like to think that I represent, in some respects, the potential and promise of the internet. I write a site called Trajectory, which is about the intersection of really about the business of technology and its impact on society broadly, which is obviously quite pertinent. And antitrust issues are something I started about writing really the first month of the site. Supported purely by subscriptions, people in the industry all over the world, frankly. And from my perspective, I hope I sit kind of at the intersection of groups like this, academic more settings, also on the business side, but with an audience in Silicon Valley that will take seriously what has to be said. And I'm from the industry. I worked in the industry previously, and at the same time, I will hopefully can stand outside of it, quite literally, being from Taiwan, and provide criticism that people will listen to.
Okay. Chad?
I'm Chad Severson. I'm the Eli B. and Harriet B. Williams Professor of Economics at Booth School. I study productivity as one of my areas of specialty, both at the micro and macro level. I also do a lot of work in other areas of industrial organization or companies' behavior.
My name is Fiona Morton. I'm an economics professor at the Yale School of Management. I'm also an industrial organization economist. Like Chad, I've focused on a variety of areas of competition and gotten into the antitrust area over the last 10 years or so.
I'm Kevin Murphy. I'm a professor of economics at Booth and also in the economics department here in Chicago. I guess I don't consider myself an antitrust economist. I just consider myself an economist. So,
Tristan.
I'm Tristan Harris. I used to be a design ethicist at Google after I had a small startup that was acquired by them. So I have a background sort of as a tech entrepreneur, also on the psychology manipulation side, which I'll talk probably more about, and now run something called the Center for Humane Technology.
I'm Robert Epstein. I'm senior research psychologist at the American Institute for Behavioral Research and Technology. Been a research psychologist for almost 40 years. One of my specialties in the last 5 years has become online influence. And so that's what I'll be talking about a little bit later.
Great, thank you all. So we're going to kick off. Ben has kindly agreed to give us a whirlwind tour of the platform firms, just looking at their rise as businesses and also how those business models work. Ben, over to you.
Great. The rise of digital platforms. Just a quick overview. Patrick asked me to kind of just re-emphasize how large and dominant these companies sort of are. And an interesting way to think about it is, Tristan mentioned, or Patrick mentioned via Tristan, the amount of time people spend on their phones. If you think about the top apps that are on phones, you go down this list, and it's very small type, so I will save you the trouble by highlighting the fact that of these, Google has 7 of them, Facebook has 3 of them, Amazon only has 1. They have their own sort of influence, but just by virtue of this is the percentage of people who have these apps on their phones. and everyone, the takeaway is everyone has Facebook and everyone has Google through their various properties. Another way to just think about the sort of traditional what they do, Google dominates search. This is actually search in the US. It's much higher worldwide, actually. Worldwide, it's closer to 90%, and has been for many, many years. In the US, it hovers in the 60s. And this is the time spent on social networks. And the thing to keep in mind is that blue line is Facebook, but that black line is Instagram, which is also a Facebook property. And the back end, the advertising side, is shared, which is a sort of critical thing to understand about these companies. One thing that you'll find in common with these companies is they exist in markets that are growing secularly, and then within the market themselves, they're growing their share. So this is advertising, all sorts of advertising in the US. And you can see that digital advertising is taking over rather completely the entire market. And this is a trend that's been going for quite some time. And within digital advertising itself, Facebook and Google are increasing their share of that. So a clear sort of, again, if you look at it from sort of the consumer perspective, it's one thing, but when you look at where the money actually flows, there is certainly a strong argument that this is a duopoly for all intents and purposes. This is a similar story you can tell about Amazon. This is the share of e-commerce for total retail in the US. Again, just sort of steadily growing. But within e-commerce itself, Amazon's share of e-commerce is growing. So not only is e-commerce growing, but Amazon's is driving that growth. And in fact, exceeding the growth overall, taking more and more share. And just yesterday, Jeff Bezos announced in his shareholder letter that Amazon has 100 million Prime subscribers. This is worldwide. The US is probably in the 60s. Again, this is the first time we've gotten an official number. But these are people for whom their shopping experience doesn't even entail any sort of competitive comparison because they just start at Amazon because they've already sort of paid for it. And to Patrick's point, they are certainly rewarded for that very well. This is the market cap of the top 5 companies. I'm focusing today on Facebook and Amazon and Google because Apple and Microsoft are platform companies. They're ones that are perhaps a little bit more traditional, in that Apple, sells you devices. The way the App Store works is certainly very similar to the way these other properties work. But Microsoft, again, the same thing in enterprise. Microsoft actually faces a much more challenging competitive environment in general. I think it speaks well to how the company has sort of transformed itself over the past few years, that it actually did exceed Google in market cap earlier this week. The thing I wanted to get into, though, is how these companies sort of accrue their power in the first place and their size in the first place. And I think it's really critical to understand this to have an effective discussion about antitrust, because the means by which these companies win is very, very different than the means by which companies sort of won in the past. And it's useful to think about Yahoo and Google. Yahoo is certainly nowhere near this chart for lots of reasons, but Yahoo was very famous at the beginning of the internet, where if you think about the internet being a pile of straw, and you wanted to find the proverbial needle in the straw, well, in the internet in 1994, it was very simple. There just weren't that many things out there. So Yahoo, this is the first version of Yahoo. Yahoo could be out there, and you could very easily, they could literally organize the entire internet. Like there were social science. There were 115 articles about social science on the internet in 1994, and you could actually go through and manually build an index that would have all that sort of stuff. By 1996, it was getting a little more challenging. I mean, finding a needle in this is going to be a little bit harder. Yahoo is kind of becoming a little bit more complex trying to find stuff. They dropped the number because who could actually keep track of the numbers? It became more and more, meaningless. By 1998, I mean, Yahoo is trying to manage this mess. But again, to find a needle is becoming much more challenging. And really, quite frankly, it was becoming much more like this. You're not going to find a needle here. It's going to be much more challenging. And the problem for Yahoo is that the web was increasing exponentially, the amount of places that you could go. And Yahoo, sort of by virtue of it being a much more sort of manual process, I'm grossly oversimplifying, but it could only scale linearly. And so this linear and exponential mismatch. And frankly, this actually understates the problem, because the truth is that the number of web pages were increasing even faster than the number of websites. Think about a newspaper being online. That's one site, but every day it's actually generating tens, if not hundreds, of new pages every single day. And what happened with Google is Google introduced a new sort of technology where instead of looking at all the pages, Google looked at the links, looked at the sort of interconnect between those pages, and used that to understand the entire web, where it just became a very small sort of piece of Google. And if you think about it, so number one, the experience was just astronomically better. I mean, just from the day Google launched, it was so far superior to everything else that everyone went to use it. And number two, the bigger the web got, the implication of the way Google worked is the bigger the web got, the better Google became. So there was a positive feedback loop where more web pages, more links made Google more attractive, made it more attractive to users. More users were on Google meant more data going into Google, more feedback about which link they clicked on, understanding what worked better. And you got this sort of positive feedback loop where actually Google got better and better the bigger and bigger it became. And this idea of there being a sort of positive feedback loop that comes from being really good at one thing is what drives all these sorts of companies. I mean, Google's about information, and it used to be information was about newspapers. You would get a bundle every day or buy it at the stand, and that had all the news that you wanted. And the reason why newspapers were so fabulously profitable for a very long time is they built a bundle. They integrated the editorial and the advertising. Why? Because what was the real problem with getting information? The problem was actually getting it in front of people's eyeballs. And so by controlling printing presses, by controlling delivery trucks, things along those lines, that was what drove the profits. And it was about controlling supply, and by controlling supply, you were able to control distribution, and you're able to make lots of money. The internet completely flips that on its head. Because distribution costs are effectively zero, the marginal costs are zero, the more difficult problem is not distribution. That's now free. The problem is discovery, is finding what you're looking for, is finding that needle. And by controlling discovery, all the end users go to Google first. And all the suppliers have to sort of organize themselves to serve Google. And if you think about it, every single website out there, they do special work. I just work on my website to make the site better for Google, to make it easier for Google to understand what's on the site. Google has like a recipe template. All the recipe sites put all their data in the Google specified template because they want to, and then for the user perspective, that's great. It's great I can go to Google and immediately get something that I want to understand in a format that's easy for me to understand. And then Google, of course, drops advertisements right in front of it. And if you're an advertiser, it's a great situation. Would you rather kind of spray and pray, as it were, or put your ad exactly in front of the people that are looking for what you have to sell? And this idea of the internet before going from a sort of controlling distribution and thus being able to integrate and make money, switching to discovery being the real challenge and owning the consumer relationship and then having your suppliers modularize themselves and organize themselves according to your specification is what happens with all these companies. For Facebook, your friends were intimately associated with the things that you did. That could be school, it could be clubs, it could be your neighborhood, it could be your church, whatever sort of thing. After the internet it comes along, it's all those pieces are broken up individual pieces and mixed together with news and quizzes and whatever else you might be interested in, and then pushed to you. And pushed you in a state where you're usually kind of wasting time, relaxed, much more amenable to advertising in many regards. Amazon, the same sort of thing. Real estate was an integral part of retail. Shelf space was the linchpin on which CPG companies are built. And if there's no more shelves, that entire sort of edifice falls apart, and now you're starting at Amazon. You're going there first. You're typing in something into search. And again, organizers and suppliers organizing themselves on the backside. And again, this has benefits. It's not so great for P&G. If you're a sort of small-scale sort of e-commerce provider selling one thing, Amazon providing an entire platform to get everything out there, it makes things possible that weren't possible previously. There are certainly, with everything, trade-offs. The big question, though, I think, for antitrust is this quote from Larry Page, which is, our competition is only a click away. And you've all heard some variation of this with regards to these companies. And the fact is that it's true. You can go to Bing, you can go to DuckDuckGo, which doesn't track your information. You can go to other e-commerce sites. You can go to other social networks. I'm sure we'll get into the challenges of not doing that, but bear with me here. The issue, though, is customers don't want to. It's not that they can't, it's that no one wants to go anywhere else. This feedback loop where Google provided this key sort of technology that was better, and that set off this virtuous cycle where suppliers came onto Google's platform, making it better for them. Thus, more users came on, giving Google more power, bringing on more suppliers. This virtuous cycle is what characterizes all these sort of internet companies. You'd see it not just here, but companies like Netflix or Uber or Airbnb as well. So all these are aggregators. They control demand. They deliver a superior user experience. They pull suppliers on the platforms on their terms, benefit from scale, and the implication is they do tend towards winner take all. because the bigger you are, the better you are, at least from a consumer perspective, at least in the short term. And I think that right there is sort of the paradox of these sort of companies in figuring out antitrust policy going forward. So thank you very much.
Ben, thank you very much. So Chad, you're an economist, you're an expert on productivity. One of the big questions is how much impact have these firms had on the economy? Often Silicon Valley makes this claim that it can transform the efficiency and ease with which we live our lives. Is there any evidence that's actually happening?
Not much so far, anyway. So I think it's useful to keep in perspective that the rise of these companies coincides with historically slow productivity growth. We've been in, not just we, the US, we, the world, have been in a productivity slowdown for over a decade now as these companies, which we sort of think as the bleeding edge of technology, have been, you know, what most people think are the ones pushing back the envelope. It hasn't shown up in the aggregate productivity statistics. Now, one argument out there is that they are having an impact, but there's a measurement problem. I've written extensively on that, so have others. I think the evidence is that that's not the case. There are certainly measurement problems that raised by these, productivity measurement problems raised by these kind of companies. But there have always been measurement problems, and to explain a slowdown in growth, you need a change in measurement problems, not the existence of measurement problems, and there just isn't evidence that that's going on. So there's this a little bit of a notion that the brain space dedicated to these companies right now at least exceeds their economic space that they actually fill up. You know, the entire information sector, which is all of telecom, all of broadcasting, publishing, online and off, and some other sectors. That's less than 5% of GDP. The data and something sector, it's got a lot of words and I can't remember it, which is where these platforms fit. That's less than 1% of GDP. So, you know, again, for all the attention we give them, I think if you're going to justify it in terms of importance to the economy, I think it needs to be forward-looking rather than retrospective, certainly.
And Chad, what about profits? Because their share is materially higher, right?
That's a good point. And actually, I think, so if you're thinking about forward-looking impact, I think that's where you would point to the valuation numbers, because those are about people's expectations of forward influence. And for the fact that they don't seem to have moved the productivity needle yet, the fact is that they do a large share of the R&D that goes on in the world and certainly in the country. So, you know, Facebook, Alphabet, Netflix, Amazon, those four right there, they do about $50 billion a year in R&D. Total R&D is about $550 billion. So they're doing like 10%, just them. And then if you throw Microsoft and Apple on top of that, that's another $25 billion a year. So there's still potential for them to really start moving productivity growth in a faster, accelerated direction, and I've also written about that a little bit. But that, as yet, is still potential. It just hasn't shown up. So I think, you know, it's not to say that these aren't important or they're not having an important effect now, but I think it's a useful thing to keep in mind as we talk about the sector.
And is your argument that they are not important or that they don't deliver one of the promises that they claim to have? Those are two distinct points, right?
I agree. It's not that it's not important, and certainly in a forward-looking sense, that's where I would be paying a lot of attention. I just think that they, and not to say they've had no impact, but again, I think the amount of attention that we give to them relative to the actual effect they've had on the economy is, I think, a little bit disproportionate.
Okay. Tristan, I think you've been called the conscience of Silicon Valley, which feels like a very weighty label, one that might be hard to live up to. You've also been an entrepreneur, you've worked at Google. A lot of your focus has been on the kind of asymmetry of power between the user of the platform firms and the companies themselves. Talk about that for us.
Yeah. Well, so first on this point about how much attention we give to these platforms and how much value we get. So I'll just say, from my background, I was a magician as a kid, and magic teaches you that you can easily manipulate people's attention in all sorts of very predictable ways. People's short-term memory is only so much. Their attention is limited, and it's very easy to control it by simply like using your body language, things like that. So my background, which I think is very relevant, is I studied at Stanford at a lab called the Stanford Persuasive Technology Lab that basically took young engineering students. Instead of saying, when you think about the engineers of Silicon Valley and Stanford, you think about, these technologists, they're building these companies, they're using AI. But my friends in the class who were the founders of Instagram and we studied this lab that basically teaches you the way to win in Silicon Valley now is by figuring out how to capture human attention. How do you manipulate people's deepest psychological instincts so you can get them to come back? So Instagram one day, just this sort of product where you can post photos, and they say, how are we going to get people to come back every day? I know, let's add this thing called the number of followers you have. Because now that you have some followers, you want to check in every day to see how many followers you have. It's a great reason to get you coming back. But it becomes this kind of arms race for basically who's good at getting attention and who's better in the race to the bottom of the brainstem to hijack the human animal. You add to that AI, and you basically have this asymmetric relationship. So just in the same way that when someone uses a screen, like they don't really realize they're walking into an environment where there's 1,000 engineers on the other side of the screen who asymmetrically know way more about their mind, their psychology, have 10 years about what's ever gotten them to click, use AI and the biggest prediction engines to play chess against that person's mind, and play way more moves ahead on the chessboard. And that's the reason why when you land on YouTube and you wake up 2 hours later being like, what the hell just happened? What videos did I just see? The reason that happened is YouTube was playing chess against your mind. So what happens when computers play chess against human beings? Like you take Garry Kasparov, and he sits in front of a chessboard, and he in the early days of playing chess against computers, it was kind of fun. It was fun to play. They're kind of hard. And then as they get better, they start to make these surprising moves, and then they make some move, and you're like, that was kind of a dumb move. And then 3 moves later, they just total checkmate. They beat you, right? It's because what is intelligence? It means they can see more moves ahead on the chessboard than you can. They're simply way beyond the capacity of this instrument. And we're born with one of these. We don't have more. We're bringing evolutionary hardware. So as a friend likes to say, it's like bringing a knife to a space laser fight. And so when you wake up from that YouTube experience, what's happened is that YouTube supercomputers, powered by Alphabet and Google, are basically deploying the best supercomputers in the world, not at climate change, not at solving cancer, but at basically hijacking human animals and getting them to stay on screens. And so I think we have a name for these kinds of asymmetric relationships. They're fiduciary relationships, when one party can massively exploit another party. Except when you take that into the realm of like Facebook, you have it as not just the ability to exploit the other party, but you have an unprecedented level of asymmetry. Facebook is like a psychotherapist who knows every single detail of your life, including the details of your inner life, in the sense that it doesn't just know, who you click on late at night at 2 in the morning, and what you post and your opinions on immigration and your photos and your family and who you talk to the most and who your friends are. It also intermediates every single one of your communications. It knows what colors your brain lights up to, if I give you a red button or a green button or a yellow button. It knows which words activate your psychology. It knows an unprecedented amount of information about what will manipulate you. If there's ever been a precedent or a need for defining something as being an asymmetric or fiduciary relationship, it's this one. Moreover, once you saw that you would have like a set of psychotherapists who had this level of access to human beings and their minds, what would you want that psychotherapist business model to be? Would you want to be paying that psychotherapist, or would you want that psychotherapist to instantly take all that personal information about you and then sell it to used car salesmen, the most intimate details of your life? So their business model is so obviously misaligned. The advertising business model is so obviously misaligned with this combination of asymmetric power. And that's what I hope we get to talk more about. I don't know how long I'm supposed to go. I'm just sort of riffing.
Can I ask an elementary question?
Sure.
Do you think the big tech firms care? Do they have a conscience?
What's fascinating is that on a human level, everyone you meet is nice and kind and actually wants to do the best thing for the world. So my getting into this was in 2013, I made a presentation at Google that said, Google has a moral responsibility in how we shape 2 billion people's attention, because that's just going to shape elections, culture, thoughts, etc. And the presentation went viral, and I ended up becoming a design ethicist, which is sort of a self-crafted role. And the reason I bring that up is the response this presentation got, that when it went viral, was this is important, and we don't disagree with you. We're happy that we're having this conversation. But at the end of the day, business kind of went on as usual. And it's not because they said, well, if we do what you're saying, we're going to lose money. It was just because there's just too many efforts and priorities and performance reviews that are basically based on measuring exactly the problem, meaning you're incentivized to do exactly more of what, if you're at YouTube, like getting people to spend time on videos, even if those videos are conspiracy theories. The product manager who's 25 years old, going to stay at YouTube for 2 years, went to a good school, their job is just to show on their resume that I made the engagement numbers on videos go up. And then you wake up 2 years later and YouTube's driven 15 billion views to Alex Jones videos, which I'm not kidding. YouTube has driven 15 billion views to Alex Jones conspiracy theory videos. That's just one small part. And that's not videos people sought out themselves. That's actually YouTube driving the recommendation. And so the problem is that the incentives of maximizing time and attention are just misaligned with this.
And they just overwhelm anything else.
It overwhelms everything else.
Okay, well, we're fortunate to have one of the few people who has done cutting-edge empirical research on the capacity of the platforms to manipulate mass opinion or influence it. Robert, tell us about your work.
Yes, my work is very disturbing, honestly. If you, it really is. If you saw the numbers that I see on my screens every day, I think you'd be very worried. If you have kids, I have 5 of them, you'd be especially worried. The work I do complements what Tristan was just talking about. Tristan is talking about what some people now call internet addiction. He's talking about the mechanisms, specific mechanisms to get people in front of their screens. Did you see how rude I was a few minutes ago? I actually pulled this out and looked something up right in the middle of people talking. It's just horrible. But what I stumbled upon quite by accident in late 2012 or early 2013 was a particular mechanism that shows how you can shift opinions and votes once you've got people hooked to the screen. And these days it's gone beyond that. It's gone to these devices such as Google Home, which uses sound to hook people and influence people. The first effect that we discovered, we called the search engine manipulation effect, SEME. We showed that simply by putting search results into a particular order, you could easily shift 20% or more of the votes of undecided voters up to 80% in some demographic groups after one search with no one aware that they are being manipulated. And what's even stranger about this is that the very few people who could see that they were seeing tilted search results, biased search results, if you want to use that term, they shift even farther in the direction of the bias. So simply being aware that you're seeing search results that favor one candidate or another, one cause or another, one company or another, is no protection against the influence that this ordering has. So quick footnote here, if you're some of the people who are caught up in the Cambridge Analytica scandal or the Macedonian teenagers scandal, or I could go on, you're looking in the wrong place for where the power lies. The power lies in 2 things. Who does the filtering of the information we see? And of course, that's mainly one company. That's Google. And to a lesser extent, Facebook, and then to a much lesser extent, Twitter and a bunch of other companies. And even more important, it turns out, who does the ordering of the information? It's filtering and ordering that matters. It's no longer the content that matters. It's just the filtering and the ordering. So don't worry about Cambridge Analytica. That's just a content provider. Well, it turns out that SEME, which we end up publishing in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and that article from PNAS has since been downloaded more than 94,000 times, which is very unusual for a scientific piece. But SEAM is one of just 5 effects that we're studying now, all of which are almost completely invisible to people, have enormous impact. These are some of the largest effects ever discovered in the behavioral sciences. And since they use ephemeral stimuli, they leave no trace, or in other words, they leave no trace for authorities to track. So these are some of the largest sources of influence ever invented. I would say the search engine is the most powerful source of mind control ever invented in the history of humanity. And the fact that it's mainly controlled by one company in almost every country in the world except Russia and China, that just astonishes me. So I don't want to go on here too long, but just mention one other effect which we're about to go public with actually next week. So I can't go into the details right now. But another effect that we're about to go public with is called SSE, or search suggestion effect. And here we have shown in 16 months of very rigorous experiments, we've shown that Google has the power to begin shifting opinions from the very first character you type into the search bar. And they are exercising that power. So if you don't believe me, pull out your devices, type the letter A, and you will see, most likely depending on your search history, you will see that they are influencing you from the first character that you type. And we have determined through our research that the search suggestion effect can turn a 50-50 split among undecided voters into a 90-10 split just by manipulating search suggestions. One of the simplest ways to do that is to suppress negative suggestions, which Google does very, very systematically. So for example, in 2016, if you typed in Hillary Clinton is on Bing or Yahoo, you got 8 or 10 suggestions of the sort: Hillary Clinton is evil, Hillary Clinton is the devil, Hillary Clinton is dying of cancer, Hillary Clinton is awful, et cetera, et cetera. Every single suggestion was like that, because that's in fact what people were searching for at the time. You can verify that on Google Trends. But if you type Hillary Clinton is on Google, you got, I have screenshots of all of this, Hillary Clinton is awesome, Hillary Clinton is winning. That's it. That's all you got. So now we know what happens when you suppress negatives. Now we know what happens when you give certain search suggestions and not others. Now we know very precisely what the optimal number of suggestions is to influence people. And so we've measured this, and that's what we do. So we've got SEAM, we've got SSE, we're studying 3 other effects, and they are frightening. They are disturbing because, again, generally speaking, they're completely invisible to people. They're not traceable by authorities. And let me just add one more thing here, that is, we've also developed a monitoring system. And this, I think, I don't think antitrust actions actually are going to help us that much because technology moves so fast. I don't think laws or regulations are going to help us that much. But we have developed what we think is a partial solution to the problem of these massive companies and the influence that they're having. And that is, we have developed a monitoring system. The Washington Post first reported some of our work on this monitoring system in March of 2017. A system of basically looking over people's shoulders. I'd love to look over Tristan's shoulders while he's on his computer to see what he's looking up. But we've developed a system of setting up a Nielsen-type network of people around the world, looking over their shoulders, seeing what those ephemeral stimuli are that they're being presented with, and then aggregating those and analyzing them very rapidly. So I'm now working with prominent business people and academics on 3 continents to take the system that we developed and scale it up. And basically, we believe that with a network of monitoring systems running worldwide 24/7, we will have some protections. We will make these companies accountable to the public. We will be able to report irregularities to authorities, to law enforcement, to regulators, antitrust investigators, as these various manipulations are occurring. And we think long term, that is the solution to the problems we're facing with these big tech companies.
Robert, just very quickly, so in terms of the manipulation, is it being done with some kind of specific intent? In other words, is Google saying, let's favor Hillary Clinton? Or is your point that the algorithms just have embedded within them a whole load of, frankly, somewhat arbitrary biases which we've all become slaves to? Because that's a very important distinction.
Well, there the two W's come into play. Whistleblowers, I consider Tristan a kind of whistleblower. Certainly one came forward from Facebook, as I'm sure you're aware, about a year ago, who revealed that Facebook was hiring people who were systematically removing conservative-leaning news stories from their news feeds. But without either whistleblowers or warrants, basically, I don't know where these biases, if you want to call them that, are coming from. They could just be from neglect. We build an algorithm and the algorithm happens to shift people one way or another, or they could be quite deliberate, and it's probably a combination. But let me tell you, if you buy into this notion, which Google sells through its PR people, that a lot of these funny things that happen with the wrong answers that they give, or sending people to Alex Jones videos, if you buy into this notion that they try to sell, that all of this is organic, it's all driven by users, that's complete and utter nonsense. I've been a programmer since I was 13. I can tell you, you can build an algorithm that sends people to Alex Jones videos or away from Alex Jones videos. You can easily alter whatever your algorithm is doing to send people anywhere you want to send them. So the bottom line is there's nothing really organic. Google has complete control over what they put in front of people's eyes. That's why, again, it's very important, I believe, that we set up a worldwide system
Yeah, got it.
of monitoring.
Thank you. Kevin, you've been involved with antitrust and regulation of tech for some time, and I think you're someone who's emerged with a sense of humility about what humans can really do. Can we really predict the future? Can we really create regulatory systems that operate in the way we intend? Talk to us about your sense of tech right now and antitrust.
Okay, first off, I would like to say, based on what I've just heard, particularly the last two, I'm not sure what that has to do with it being concentrated among certain people, because it was discussion of technology and the ability to influence people's choice. And it's about, that would be true if we had 20 firms doing it or one firm doing it. What they choose to do is, I would think as an economist, driven by what people are willing to pay for who want to influence people and the willingness of people to be influenced in various ways. And I'm not saying there can't be negative things that happen when you come up with a new technology. I just haven't really heard yet how that's intimately tied to concentration. Would this be an easier problem to solve if we had 100 firms out there all trying to influence people using these same methods? It might be a much more difficult regulatory problem in that world. Much be different to measure, different to regulate. So it's not clear how this is related to the concentration issue per se. So that's one thing I'd like to say. The other is, in terms of the discussion that somehow we're in this brave new world, that also seems odd to me. Because, we could have been back in the days of TV and talking about 3 major networks having all the influence over people and what they buy and how they think and political access to people, because they sit there like zombies in front of the TV set for 7 hours a day. And that's not new either. Or the idea that there's this feedback effect. Anybody ever heard of applications barrier to entry and Microsoft? I remember the days where Yahoo was thought to have an insurmountable first mover advantage in search. Or AOL had an insurmountable first mover advantage in access to people's eyeballs. Or Microsoft Media Player was going to dominate digital music. Or let's go down the list. The idea that we're any good at predicting how these markets are going to move, or any good at shaping how they're going to move, seems to me to be odd. It also seems like an odd use of antitrust, a poor use of antitrust. Anything I learned at Chicago when thinking about antitrust is about competition. Concentration in some circumstances can be a proxy for competition, but concentration and reducing concentration is not the objective of antitrust. Antitrust is there, as a Chicago view, to ensure that consumers get the benefits of competition. And sometimes things get more competitive and markets get more concentrated because the people who are able to best serve their customers are able to capture an even bigger share in the market than they would in a world in which there's less competition. So one thing that really worries me about the discussion I hear here is we keep talking about concentration as if that's the bottom line of competition. And more concentration means less competition, and less concentration means more competition. That, to me, is not what competition is about. And so I guess I'm resistant on both fronts. First off, most of what we're talking about has nothing to do with concentration, at least as far as I've heard. These problems would exist absent concentration. And secondly, I think a focus on concentration as the bottom line of antitrust, I think, is misguided as well. And the idea that we have some new world that doesn't look like things we've seen before, I don't know. I don't see it. I think they can be different in type and different in different ways. I mean, I remember, if you go back to the 60s, what was one of the major antitrust policies of the 60s? Was to keep General Motors from becoming too dominant in the auto industry. That was kind of one of the big thoughts in the antitrust policy in the 60s. Well, somebody else took care of that for us. Namely, the Japanese and other import auto manufacturers did a pretty good job of making sure GM didn't get too dominant in the automobile industry. IBM consent decree. Let's go down the line. Where's the big success story here of people seeing how an industry is going to evolve and saying, boy, we want to get ahead of that and we're going to regulate that from the point of view of reducing concentration. So I think it is a huge challenge. I'm not saying I could do it. I can't do it very well either. But I think we need to be humble about what we can and can't do. And I also think it's always tempting to think we live in these unprecedented times where things are changing like they never have. That's why I go back to Chad. You know, the idea that there's a productivity slowdown, one thing I think Chad's shown before, these have happened before. That is, it's great to look at a chart of productivity growth in a country like the United States. If you step back to like the 100-year, it looks very constant. You'd say, man, we've just been growing at a constant rate. You zoom in to like a 2-year window, and then you're looking at the business cycle. You get to like a decade to 2 decade, 20th century's been marked by fast growth, slow growth, whether it's the 70s, whether it's the teens, whether it's the 30s, whatever. So, and one question I had for Chad was, we wouldn't, given they're 1% of the economy, how big are they going to be in those overall productivity statistics, right? We wouldn't expect a small fraction of the economy to have such a big effect. Anyway, that's kind of my perspective on things. I don't see really the connection between concentration and a lot of the issues we're talking about, or that concentration really exacerbates those issues. Nor do I see that concentration is really the focus, should be the focus of antitrust. I definitely think competition is much more where we're at.
And Kevin, when you were involved in the Microsoft case in sort of 99, 2000, how similar does the mood feel now to that period, right? Bill Gates, we all love Bill Gates now, and he's a kind of cuddly philanthropist, but back then he was a kind of villain in the same way that Zuckerberg seems to have become. Does it feel like there's a sort of similar, almost slightly panicky atmosphere?
Yeah, I think one of the things that happens when you get involved in those kinds of things is you realize people looking in from the outside kind of see the points that are the most salient. Maybe this is related to psychology. People see these points in the industry. But you go back and you look at the industry itself and how it evolved and why a firm was successful or not. Typically, it has very little to do with these things that people are talking about, whether they were anti-competitive or pro-competitive. They're just small potatoes in the big scheme of things. That's the thing that struck me in Microsoft. Many of the things people talked about, when you looked at it, really weren't the big deals. So, for example, people talk about, I'll get into it later.
Okay.
No, we'll stop here.
Fiona, I've left you with the hardest job at the end of the kind of remarks. You're going to talk a bit about regulation, but the question I have is how on earth do we fit this incredible list of complaints that realm from addiction to sort of monopoly type behaviour to manipulating elections? How do we fit all of that into the existing regulatory framework? There's clearly a kind of antitrust element there potentially, but there's also a much broader range of political and social questions.
That's hard. I'll try to tie my remarks into some of what people have said up till now. I think the answer to what is new, a little bit in response to Kevin, is the precision of the targeting. Instead of everybody watching ABC, there's now an individual history and an ability to target at the individual level. And I think the magnitude of the persuasive effect is therefore different. And that's something as a society we need to grapple with and decide if we're comfortable selling ourselves in that way or not. And that's perfectly fine kind of discussion for a democracy to have. Why does concentration matter in that context? Because we're getting one draw. If you have a particular way, if Google is doing things in a particular way and 95% of people are using Google, then the outcome of the election is whatever Google's doing. That then creates a real political problem and everybody's worried about what Google's doing and so on. If there were 30 search engines and everybody was evenly distributed across those 30 search engines and each one had a bias, we wouldn't think that any one of them was perhaps tipping an election. So that's the sense in which the concentration really does matter to the problems that we're talking about. Just a brief remark on the productivity statistics. I mean, I watch my own children. Certainly, aggregate productivity in the United States is not increased by their use of these platforms. Definitely not. They're just like doing less homework, and so that's clear. I mean, what's productive? Email is productive. Desktop applications are productive for me. I think, however, it is a little misleading to say they're only a small part of GDP because if you're using that search engine or that tool to get to the rest of GDP, then you're influencing a much larger part of GDP than you actually are as a business. So if I use the search engine to choose which restaurant to go to, which car to buy, and so forth, then there's a lot of commerce that's being affected by these platforms. So just returning to regulation, I think the big lesson here is to look at it in what we call an error cost framework. So if we thought we were doing some kind of optimal sort of regulation yesterday, and now we've discovered enormous new costs and our democracy isn't working anymore, then the cost of not regulating just went up relative to what we thought it was yesterday. So in that world, we need to do more, probably. We need to, that's a cost, and if we think that's a cost, then the benefit from regulation just went up because the cost of not regulating just went up. So I think that's the way to think about it. It's not that we're good at regulating. Of course, we're going to make a mistake, but we balance the mistakes from regulation. My photos aren't shared quite as well as they might have been. The search term doesn't come up quite as fast as it otherwise would because we've regulated the company away from innovating in that space. But then there's the cost of not regulating, which is my democracy doesn't work anymore. And we have to balance those two things. And I think as a society, we're sort of having a national conversation about how that latter thing is a lot bigger than we thought it was before. In terms of the antitrust part, that's not a competition issue. That's something for our democracy to discuss as a whole. In terms of competition, we have laws on the books to enforce our competition laws. We can do that anytime. I think there's a little bit of a shortage of really tight theories of harm. That would be my reading of the landscape, and that's why I think we haven't seen those cases move forward. I mean, there's also a question of political will to bring those cases, but even with political will, you have to have a really good explanation of how competition is being harmed, and that's, I think, still something that's a work in progress among the community, many of whom are gathered here.
So your sense of how a sort of theoretical regulatory reaction would happen is that there's a sort of set of quite narrow antitrust offences, if you like, that may have taken place, but then there's also a sort of separate, almost political discussion about their impact on a vast array of issues in our
the
lives.
mental health of our children, the way our communities interact, the way everybody votes. These are big, huge, important issues, and I think it's right for us to consider whether we want to impose some rules on these platforms. I have, no idea what the right answer is, but I think it's a conversation that absolutely should be happening.
Kevin, just very quickly. Yep.
I think it's a mistake to just think that the benefits of regulation went up, but the potential costs of regulation also went up. To the extent people are relying on these platforms to do more and more things to help them search for the products they want to buy or the jobs they want to get or entertain their children and those things, it's not just that the benefits of regulation went up, the cost of general regulation probably went up too. So it's not clear you need more regulation for sure, or more tight regulation. I agree, this is a more important area of the economy, so we should pay probably more attention to it than we did before. But that's like saying we should pay more attention to automobile safety when there's, automobiles become a bigger part of the economy. It doesn't mean we should adopt a more rigid regulatory standard versus a free market standard. That's a very different question. So that's, I would like to say.
I'd like to have a sort of sanity check on a couple of things, and we'll move on to questions from the audience in a bit. But Ben, when you hear everyone talking about these terrible tech companies and all the terrible things they do you think we're accurately capturing the good things they do, the fact that they're so popular, the ease with which they help us do things? Do you think the ledger in terms of their benefits and costs has become skewed in terms of perhaps this discussion and the antitrust debate?
I would say on this panel it's not very balanced. But I think that ties into your point about the sort of impact. There's a famous quote, which my phone is very helpful in looking up during this panel. Robert Soldel, 1987, saying, "You can see the computer age everywhere but in the productivity statistics." And the reality is that the 1980s, all these companies integrating these sort of IT sort of things then sort of exploded into a productivity explosion in the 1990s. And so I'm quite wary of pointing to productivity, and that was felt broadly, even though the industry was relatively small, it was felt all over the economy. And so I'm wary of tying too closely into what's happening today, into making pronouncements about whether it's good or bad, because we already have a clear example in the exact same industry of how that was a total mistake. So that would just be one sort of view of that. And the other point to Professor Morton's point about her children on their phones, I mean, one could certainly argue that in fact these platforms are tampering productivity in some respects, but that goes back to my point about consumers loving these platforms. The amount of consumer surplus generated by all of these companies is frankly astronomical. And yes, we absolutely should put a price on the ads and the targeting, all that sort of stuff, and the impact on our democracy, however you want to frame it. But I think that ledger certainly needs to incorporate the fact that I can quite literally look up a quote from 1987 in the middle of a panel and contribute to this discussion, and that did not contribute a single percentage to GDP in the slightest sort of thing. But I think the broader point, though, and Professor Murphy drove at this, is I think it's really important to distinguish. I would think broadly there's two types of regulation. One type of your sort of traditional regulatory regulating against sort of harm sort of thing, and to think about that, if we believe these platforms are as down as they are and the harms are as high as they are, and we need to act, we also need to keep in mind the implication of acting is less competition over time. something like the GDPR that is some of the most popular thing in the world.
Just explain what that is.
Oh, GDPR, the European privacy regulations. Those are going to deeply entrench Facebook and Google. Why? Facebook, Google is going to be very, very painful for them. They're going to spend all kinds of money. They might hurt the revenue. It absolutely might. But you compare that to the impact on everyone else, depending on third parties to do their monetization, where the question of consent is much more difficult. The question of the data processor and control, all these sort of things go into it, are much more complicated. Whereas Facebook and Google, and even Google is the best example, you still walk up to Google and say, I'm searching for this. They don't need permission to serve you an ad against that term. It's still the most powerful thing they have. And if the secular trend is towards more digital advertising, which it is because advertising follows eyeballs, then the implication is that those platforms that have an inherent built-in advantage of their own data, even if they never use third-party data ever again, are going to be favored. And I would set that against the other sort of regulation, which is antitrust regulation. And I think it's very easy to conflate those two because they both have the word regulation. But the goal of antitrust regulation is to spur competition. And it's to decrease the cost of smaller competitors coming in, because those costs are actually brought forward by the platforms themselves. And I think it's very important to distinguish between those two approaches. To the extent we focus on harm, we're going to end up in a world of more regulation and less competition, which may be correct. I'm not saying that's wrong. But to the extent we focus on concentration and competition being a good thing, those may be separate issues that are important to set to the side.
So they may conflict, in other words. Yep.
I think they do conflict. I mean, and which is fine. I'm not saying conflict is a bad thing, but there is a paradox here embedded in this sort of panel itself about the things that we're talking about and the long-term impact of acting on them.
Fiona, did you want to?
Well, I think there is a whole literature and way of thinking about regulation that is designed to enhance competition. I don't think there's necessarily a conflict. I think you can choose to regulate in a variety of different ways. There are ways to regulate that are better for competition and ways that are worse. So I think the UK is a leader in this area, and things like data portability. If I own my data and my likes and my graph and my friends and everything, and I can bring that with me to an entrant,
then you will end up in front of Congress.
Promote entry. I mean, that's the kind of thing, you can set the regulation up to try to help the entrant if that's what you want to do.
Okay, we're going to talk.
Can I add one point?
Quickly.
I apologize for interrupting, but quite literally, Mark Zuckerberg is in front of Congress because of data portability. Like, that is exactly what they enabled. And people took that data and did bad things with that. But it is explicitly data portability. And it's striking that a year ago, the conversation was all about we need more data portability. And today the conversation is the exact opposite. Now, I think Facebook did a very poor job of that and were way too lax and all those sorts of things. I'm not saying they didn't. I'm just pointing out that it's so easy to think about these issues, say that's a bad thing, we should fix that, when the level of complexity and interaction effects, so all these sorts of things are incredibly deep. And you talk about, Professor Morton talked about targeting. Well, the implication of that is obviously it's not explicit. It can't be explicit. You can't explicitly do it to 2 billion people. Do algorithms have bias? For sure they do. But the scale is just, Tristan certainly understands this. The scale that these platforms operate, it's really hard to sort of even wrap your head around it, particularly, I've worked at these companies and I still have a hard time sort of grappling with it.
The second thing I just wanted to sanity check is whether it makes sense to lump all of these companies together. It's a very convenient label, but they are radically different in terms of where they generate their revenue, the extent to which they make high profits or low profits. Do they depress prices? Do they have prices high? Do they have completely different objectives? Tristan, talk about that. We've got Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, Alphabet, Facebook, maybe Netflix. Should we be lumping them together? Does it make any sense?
So I think the thing that clarifies some of this discussion is the distinction between attention-based business models. So I would call Google's search an intention-based business model, whereas you say they don't serve you an ad until someone makes a conscious choice, they think for a second, and they type something in. But attention-based businesses are based on manipulation. All of them. And just to make really super clear about what's different this time, because it is totally different than media, TV, radio, et cetera. And to the point about kids and mental health, Snapchat, if you didn't know, 100 million teenagers around the world use Snapchat. It's the #1 way for teenagers to communicate. And the way they manipulate kids into using it is by adding a feature called a streak, which shows the number of days in a row that each kid has sent a message to each friend. This is a design technique that I learned at the Stanford Persuasive Technology Lab. If you want someone to do something, you want to show the number of days in a row they've done it, so that now they have something they don't want to lose. Except now in Snapchat's case, they've created something that now two kids see that as a developmental stage of a teenager, they tie to the currency of their friendship. I am not friends with you if I don't keep that streak up. So it's like taking two kids, tying their legs together on a treadmill, hitting start at the same time. Now they both have to keep running. And I've got them hooked. Snapchat also makes a design choice to say, I'm going to buzz your phone when your friend starts talking to you. So, sorry, when they start typing. So if I just start to type, I type one character, it buzzes the other person's phone to let you know your friend is starting to type to you. Imagine doing that to a teenager who's developmentally feels as if their belonging is tied to how well I'm good at servicing the needs of my friends, right? So this is not by accident. This is totally different than looking up stuff on our phone or using it in these utilitarian ways of the desktop productivity era of the 1980s, 1990s. Photoshop didn't have 1,000 engineers on the other side of the screen using notifications, using your friends, using AI to predict what's going to perfectly addict you or hook you or manipulate you or allow advertisers to test 60,000 variations of text or colors to figure out what's the perfect manipulation of your mind. This is a totally new species of power and influence.
But do you think that set of characteristics is common to all of the companies? I mean, for example, Amazon convention,
well, right.
I mean, it may be morphing into something that's more attention-based or advertising-based, but are we categorizing the set of businesses correctly?
I just think in terms of harms, because I'm just sorting about what's the world I want to live in, right? I mean, because there's a lot of very clear and immediate and present harms to democracy, mental health, et cetera. And so I'm more concerned with the attention-based businesses, Snapchat, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, because those ones do the most harm, and their business models tied to the problem.
Kevin?
I would say, again, the methods used to play on people's ability to be addicted or to be influenced may be different this time, and they probably are different. They were different when newspapers came in and the printing press came in, and they were different when television came in and you had 3 major networks and kids addicted to TV, and kids to what they wanted to buy for Christmas or their birthday was entirely determined by what commercial was shown on one of those 3 major networks. I mean, you would have had these kinds of discussions about oversized influence, and those discussions did happen back then.
I have a device that's pushed on human skin, buzzing people use 150 times a day. That's a new level of internet access.
I agree, it's a new level, but TV was a new level of...
At the time, but we're
at the
talking
time,
about
that's what I'm saying. But I'm saying the idea that there's a new level, and that new level has happened so many times before. This is just the latest new level that we've seen.
But is your point that we're going to adapt to it?
I think my point is number of things. Well, number one, it's probably driven mostly by what the demands of the people on the different sides of the market are.
Is a kid demanding that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Kids have a demand for certain things. They're the same kids that they used to be. They want to belong with their friends. They want to have what their friends have. They want to watch the same movie that they watched 17 times before because they loved it even more every time they watched it. I mean, if you ever had a 4-year-old kid, that's been true forever. What movie you want to watch? The same movie I watched yesterday. What story do you want me to read you tonight? The same story you read me last night. That's been true forever. That's going to be true now. We're going to be able to cater to that probably better than we ever could before. When they invented the video recorder, I had the ability to show my kid the same movie over and over again. Didn't have that when there was only TV. They had to watch what was on. And they would hope the same cartoon would come on, but it took a while before they would show up again.
Robert, just give us a sense of whether, again, you think there's a difference between the companies and their conduct. I mean, Tim Cook, after the latest Facebook fiasco, made a point of talking about the idea that Apple respects your privacy, and Facebook were the bad guys. And when you talk to the companies, they each have a sort of distinct sense of how nasty or nice they are. Should we just mistrust them all, or do you think that there is a spectrum there?
Well, with all respect to Kevin. Let me say that what's happening now is completely different. There's never been anything like it before in human history. I'll just give you a quick example, which I was thinking about when I was watching Mark Zuckerberg on television.
That's my point. There wasn't anything like TV before it happened.
We've had enough on kids' films.
If on November 8th, 2016, if that morning, if Mark Zuckerberg had decided to press the enter key on his laptop, he could have sent out go out and vote reminders just to supporters of Hillary Clinton, and no one would have known that this occurred. In fact, I talked recently to a current employee of Facebook who acknowledged that yes, if he had chosen to do that, no one would have known, even at Facebook, that he had done that. Now, we know from Facebook's own published data that if he had done that, that 450,000 more people would have got off of their sofas that day and gone out to vote for Hillary Clinton. Now, did he do that? Well, I don't know. That's the problem. You see, we don't monitor such things. They're invisible to people. These manipulations are invisible to people. There's never been anything like, election of 1876 was actually manipulated by the one company that controlled virtually all long-distance communications in the United States, and that was Western Union. And it did fix that election of 1876. So you can read about that on your own. It's quite fascinating. But the point is we're now in this position where a couple of companies, which have a very different business model, by the way, than newspapers, than Apple, than Microsoft. Apple and Microsoft sell products, don't they? Facebook and Google, Twitter, they have no products. For Facebook and Google, we're the product. That's very new historically. That's never happened before. So we have huge problems here, which I think are really, truly new. We have the surveillance business model operating on a scale that defies our imagination. We have manipulation and control on a massive scale. We have, talk about concentration, we have, these enormous powers in the hands of just a couple of people who are all within a couple of miles of each other. That's never happened before.
Okay. Now, I just want to cover 2-3 things very quickly. So I'm going to ask you just to attempt to answer these quickly, but just to get to cover the ground. Chad, first of all, how likely is it that these companies are basically superseded by competitors over time? I mean, what does history tell us about that?
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, that's sort of...
Good luck with that.
Yeah, exactly. That's 24% within the next 5 years. History does tell us that often they are superseded, even when people contemporaneously think that that's not possible. Do I know whether that probability is any higher or lower than some of the examples Kevin gave? I don't know. I guess, and I'm just going to stay modest about my ability to say that.
Okay.
I mean, I think we could add one thing, which is if you have monopoly profit, you want to keep it. So the firm itself is going to attempt to stay. Right, they're going to try everything they can to stay in that position. So.
Okay. Ben, very quickly, what is the capacity of these companies to adapt their business model to a kind that is more friendly to users and addresses some of these concerns? So, for example, maybe Facebook moves to a model where it either recompenses people for the use of their data, so gives them a bigger slice of the pie, makes payments to them, or alternatively, we could pay Facebook for an advertising-free service. But is there a simple way in which these companies could adapt how they operate to address some of these concerns?
Well, I'd say embedded in your question was the presumption that there is no consumer benefit from these business models, when the reality is I get a search on Google for free, or I use Facebook for free and all those sorts of things. And again, I'm not saying there aren't other costs.
What if the price should be negative? That's I think, an interesting question.
It
we
is.
Think about zero as being the limit, but that's not true. It could be negative.
Yeah, I think
so
that's
prices could go down.
Yeah, I think that's a great. I think that really sort of unlocks thinking about this, because frankly, paying to use Facebook is a completely unworkable idea, and the reason is because Facebook, the value derives from the number and volume of people that are on it, and the moment it goes from 0 to 1 cent, that volume will plummet through the floor, and a new Facebook will come along. You'll have the exact same problem in 5 to 10 years. So that's just the fundamental way these works. I do think, though, to your point, and the reason why I would say to Professor Murphy, it is different, is the issue of these companies is because there is basically zero transaction cost to serving users. It, for the first time ever, is viable for one company to serve 7 billion people. And that has never been the case previously. And you add on these effects that I just talked about, where the more people on it, the network effect, the more valuable it becomes. The sort of ceiling is unlocked from that. And so I think the issue, or the thing to think about in terms of regulation, is more on the M&A question. Like, I think if you think about Facebook would be in have a much bigger problem right now if they didn't own Instagram, for example. But again, that requires an understanding of the network effects and how can you see Instagram 2011 and know it's going to be what it's going to be in the future. And that's just more, understanding how these new markets work.
Okay. Lastly, Fiona, would you rule out the extreme regulatory measures, make them into utilities, old AT&T style, break them up? I mean, there's most of the remedies floated over the next couple of days, I suspect, will be quite sort of subtle things about altering, how they're monitored, whether they can do takeovers, that sort of thing. But should we consider the kind of extreme options on the menu?
I don't know. I think this kind of information about the size of these effects and so on is new to me, and I think if it's really that big, then you want to think about what's the right way to counter that, and it's not clear to me that sort of breaking up a company counters that. I think we need to figure out to try to reduce the cost of any regulation that the country wants to put in place. You want to make it to be addressing the thing that you think is generating harm. So that I think requires some study.
All options on the menu.
I think, yeah, why rule anything out now?
Okay. Yeah. You've succeeded in terrifying everyone, by the way.
The European Parliament has already voted in a non-binding vote to break Google up into pieces. Remember back in the 80s, AT&T, the breakup of AT&T actually turned out to be a pretty good thing for innovation, so I think we shouldn't rule out anything at all. But also the European Commission has right now on the table a very detailed plan for regulating Google. I noticed recently that Roger McNamee, am I pronouncing his last name right, has actually introduced a plan for breaking Google up to, I think he said between 8 and 10 entities. Do I have that right?
I'm not actually sure.
Okay, between 8 and 10, I'm pretty sure is what he said. So, lots of possibilities here. I'm sure you're aware that last year the European Commission fined Google $2.7 billion, 2.4 billion euros, for having biased search rankings. They have 2 other antitrust actions still ongoing, which should wrap up soon, which will lead to even more fines. Anything is possible here. We have to look carefully, obviously, what we do and try to anticipate the consequences, but I think all options need to be on the table.
Kevin, just very
I would
quickly,
just
then I'll give
say,
you some questions.
again, history is a great place to look back. I mean, I think interoperability, those kinds of things are places where potentially we can add some value and have competition work and say, are there bottlenecks where you need to get competition, to clear some hurdles to make competition workable? I think the idea that we would want to turn this into a public utility, I would be very skeptical of for 2 reasons. One, our history isn't so great. Think railroads, right? Again, very powerful. They rule the world. Let's regulate railroads. I think the post-Staggers Act world tells us something about what happens in that regulatory bar, public utility regulation and the like. Finally, if you're worried about manipulation, I got a great idea. Let's eliminate manipulation by putting the government in charge of what information gets out. They would never manipulate what information people get.
Okay.
I mean, what planet are we from?
On that note, we've got about sort of 10-ish to 15 minutes for questions. So if you could put your hand up, please, if you'd like to ask a question. Okay, I'm not going to choose my colleague first. Sorry, Ludwig. Gentleman up there.
Great. It was a great discussion. Going to take a stab at sort of bridging some of the questions about competition and concentration with the sort of psychological points. So I will start with a quick story. I was at an event, an antitrust event, and bumped into Hal Varian at the reception. Everybody had had a couple of drinks. This is Google's chief economist. I said, Hal, come on. Competition isn't only a click away. Because people are more likely to just abandon their search than they are to go to Bing.com these days. If they're not finding what they're looking for on Google, they're more likely to just give up and walk away from their computer and do something else than go to Bing. And he said, well, that didn't used to be the case. So he confessed that in, I guess, a moment of vulnerability. So it suggests that there is something else going on, that there is like a cognitive cost to switching. And I think the difference between sort of like the addictiveness of television, years ago versus these platforms is that there's an information feedback loop, and those A/B optimizations are being used to sort of exploit users. And once you get to a point where, Ben mentioned that people don't use alternative search engines because they don't want to, but if you're not going to use it, even if it potentially contains the correct answer, is that really about wanting, or is there some type of cognitive cost here that's not being recognized? So that.
Tristan, you're the obvious.
Let's see, I was just trying to listen to a little bit. One model for this that Roger actually brings up is the 1956 antitrust case with AT&T, in which they agreed not to expand the business into new markets and made all its patents available to others at no charge. And this was essential to basically seeding Silicon Valley with the transistor and a whole bunch of new innovation that we wouldn't have gotten if we hadn't done that. I'll also say that on the network effects model, in terms of charging subscriptions, WhatsApp used to charge $1 for the subscription, and they built a business of 450 million users and got acquired by Facebook for $19 billion.
But you could first sign up without paying. They said they charged a year. Sure. And in basically every market, no one was ever actually charged. There was much more, I think, of a PR sort of ploy than an actual something that happened. Yeah. WhatsApp was funded by VC money, now it's funded by Facebook money.
More questions. Again, put your hand up. Could we do? I'm going to take 2 questions at a time in an effort to pack them in. The lady right up at the back there, please.
Hi. Thanks for the interesting discussion. So I think we could spend a lot of time talking about sort of the current issues, Facebook search. I'm interested in what you all think might be the issues we should be thinking about in the future. I think that the rise of digital assistants and voice-activated everything is going to be revolutionary. There will be 0 links that you have on your screen. There will be no one box anymore. It will be some home assistant telling you what the search result they want to tell you. How is the ad disclosure going to work? Is the assistant going to say, well, I'm going to talk to you about an ad first? So what are some of the issues we should be thinking about in terms of ensuring and protecting competition in some of these more novel, to be determined how the markets develop?
Okay, thank you. And could we also get the question from the gentleman up here, and then we can ask in a list?
Thank you. Professor Scott Morton mentioned negative prices as an idea. And obviously, if people are upset that they're not getting enough value from all the free services that Facebook provides, perhaps we could all become shareholders. And I would suggest that we already are, because Facebook is a top component of the S&P 500 index, which is in most people's retirement accounts.
Well, let's just be clear. For the people in this room, that's true. For the American population, not so much.
Very fair. And the extension of that is obviously this idea of decentralized networks with cryptocurrencies, which Ben has talked about is sort of the antidote to aggregation theory. So perhaps we could talk about that as a solution.
Okay, and then lastly, Ludwig, do you want to? No. Okay. So who wants to do the question on digital assistants, voice-activated things? Is that a threat to the incumbent firms, or does it embed them? Robert.
Well, thinking ahead, it's not just the digital assistants. Right now, Google has an advertising campaign trying to convince us to put the Google Mini Home in every single room in our house, including, they name the rooms, including the nursery. Very important to have it in the nursery. There is rock-solid evidence now that these devices are not only listening but recording continuously. There's even a court case now in which the court has reached out with a subpoena and actually pulled recordings when no one had summoned the device, no one had told the device to turn on. So there's that, thinking ahead to the future, what we're facing, and then the Internet of Things. So by 2020, which is around the corner, the Internet of Things will have expanded to more than 30 billion devices, and of course the number is just going to skyrocket from there. We've got to start thinking about how these issues, surveillance, censorship, manipulation, how they extend to this new world of devices, and that's one of the reasons why I worry whether regulation, in fact, is going to help us, because things are just moving too fast into new worlds.
Yeah, we need agreement on facts first. These devices don't continuously stream data. They have a trigger word. The reason why you can't change that trigger word is because it needs a trigger word to send it out. And not only that, there are millions of people with monitoring equipment in their homes that would pick this up immediately. But I think the digital assistant question is very, very interesting, because what broke up Microsoft was not the antitrust action. What broke up Microsoft was not competition in the operating space. What broke up Microsoft, or their dominance, I should say, was a paradigm shift in what mattered, was moving up the stack from the operating system, the APIs that mattered there, to the internet, and Google basically being the operating system of the internet, if you want to think about it in similar terms. And then moving to mobile, a similar sort of thing. In fact, it was Microsoft's dominance that made them incapable to compete effectively in mobile on the internet, because the business model was totally different, and what mattered in a product was totally different. And frankly, I think assistants, despite the fact that Google has a big advantage in the product side because of their AI and whatnot, and all their data and machine learning, I think it's a big problem for them because they have no business model. That their entire business model, which is about an auction and users choosing winners, does not work on digital assistants. And frankly, the company that's running away with it by and large is Amazon, because they're coming at it orthogonally with a different business model where their payoff is reducing the friction in purchase. And so, from my perspective, the rise of digital assistants and new ways of interacting are the single most encouraging thing about about thinking about the dominance of these platforms.
Okay, and then second question, Fiona. I think the thrust of it was, are there more decentralized forms of these companies working? Could they be mutually owned? But I hope I haven't misinterpreted your question up there. I also mentioned negative pricing.
So I don't think I understand the question, but just let's be clear that 80% of U.S. stocks are held by the wealthiest 10% of people. So if we're thinking about paying too much in the product market and getting it back as shareholders, that's
Dream on.
Yeah. For some of us that's true, and for most of the American population it's not. Which is why competitive markets are a better way to allocate goods and services. That's why we want them.
Okay, gentleman there, please.
So I have a question for Kevin. As I was looking at Ben's slides about the sort of structure of the platforms, it seems like what they're doing is accumulating buying power in the form of large numbers of users. For, say, Amazon, they accumulate 100 million people on Prime, and they have all that buying power, which they then use on the other side of the market to use leverage to drive down prices of what maybe suppliers or workers or other entities. So would that be a potentially useful framework through which to look at a competition problem? And then to that end, something like Facebook, if you're looking at it as a concentration issue, and this is something I know Ben's talked about, would it make sense to split up WhatsApp, Messenger, Facebook, and Instagram to attack that monopsony buying problem on the advertiser side?
I guess I would say a couple things. One is, and it ties into both actually influencing people's choices and also this idea of buying power. Those kinds of things, again, have been happening for Walmart. Talk Walmart. Let's talk Walmart. Let's talk the supermarket, for example, in shelf space. That is, supermarkets have the ability, and have had for a long time, the ability to affect what people buy by where they put things on the shelf or whether they have an end cap. I can tell you, I grew up working in the supermarket business. you could change how much was sold by rearranging the shelf. And
Wait,
there was a market for doing that. That is, and there were competition to get consumers into your store precisely because you could deliver
Matt,
them.
do you want to just
Yeah,
clarify something?
so I've been looking at the A&P case in 49, which is, mass buying power, and it's a very different framework from Walmart. So just in terms of that would be the framework with which you look at it, where they were using sort of category captains to extract profits from suppliers and underpricing their rivals using that.
But the question of whether you would call that monopsony is really, I think, as an economist, of whether it's output reducing or output increasing. To the extent they're expanding output rather than contracting output, it doesn't fit the classic monopsony store.
If they're taking profits from suppliers and giving it to consumers in the form of lower prices, you might say that's one of the things we want antitrust to end up doing in the end. They're kind of, so it's, I think the acid test is what happens to quantities. I agree with that.
Okay, one last question. I'm going to ask this gentleman there who's been waiting.
I'm also wondering about the relationship that Kevin Murphy raised about the concentration level and the power to manipulate. And I'm wondering whether there is, how this relation actually works at all. I'm not wondering, I'm skeptical whether breaking up Google would actually, or any other of these companies, would actually affect the manipulation incentives really at all. If we think about it as an information asymmetry problem, let's say if we have many small used car dealers or large used car dealers, it's not clear necessarily that many small used car dealers have less incentive to manipulate. There may be even a benefit of having a large company because media attention and so on may rather, let's say, focus on big companies and bring that to people's attention.
If they were smaller, they might still be very manipulative.
I mean, I think what I tried to say about that earlier is that if you're worried about the used car company, I agree. But if you're worried about an election, okay, if there are 30 different Googles, then you got 30 different candidates. If you've got one Google, you have a winner is chosen, right? So that's just a political issue that it makes, there's much more risk that something is not going to reflect the will of the people compared to if you had a fragmented industry. I think that's really just the main point.
Okay, so the hope is basically that they manipulate it into different directions.
Diversification of manipulation. We are exactly out of time. I mean, my conclusion from this discussion is the difficulty of taking a huge set of social, political issues and then trying to squeeze it into a traditional kind of economic antitrust framework. And it feels like we need, frankly, a new framework to think about all of this. I'm going to finish with a lightning fast question. I want everyone on the panel to answer as really super fast, just in a few words. Do you think the platform companies will be more powerful in 10 years or less powerful? Robert, do you want to?
In 10 years, I think the surveillance business model will have been made illegal. I think that the Google and Facebook will cease to exist as we know them now. And I'm aware of 3 projects right now that are trying to build a public index to the internet. I think the Google search engine will either have become a public utility or will have been replaced by a public index.
Tristan?
Yeah, I agree that we'll look back and find that the surveillance or attention advertising data collection-based business model will be found to be illegal when combined with AI pointed at people's brains, and that I'm not sure exactly how it will play out with the existing companies turning into more public resources, or there'll be some replacements, but something like that will change.
I will predict further out, which is if Mr. Epstein is right, we will be then deregulating when we're unsatisfied with the regulatory environment that has been introduced. That history has taught me anything is that sequence.
Okay, Fiona?
I'm afraid that I believe that people with profit are really good at hanging on to their profit, so I'm going to go for more, not less.
Chad?
All the caveats about predicting the future is hard. I think Amazon is likely to be bigger. I don't know about the others.
I'd say it's hard. History says less. I would say 10 years. I would say more. But I do think people like Tristan are the biggest threat to these companies. And the reason is because their power accrues not from controlling railways or telephone wires. Their power accrues from people continue making affirmative choices to use their platforms, and that's what gives them monopsony power, which I think is a great way to think about this issue. Matt's exactly right. And the way I think ultimately that power will be undone is through the political process.
Thank you very much indeed to our panelists, and also thank you to the audience.
You're good at this.
I will make one change, which is maybe buying power.